Well, hi everybody. I hope you can see me up there in Queensland. It's wonderful to be with you and to share this opportunity to think about the union, our circumstances in Australia, how to make a better world and a better health system. Your theme is a wonderful theme, the theme of perseverance. I know in my own life how important it has been to persevere. Persevere as a mother, persevere as a daughter, persevere as a worker, as a unionist, and now to persevere in the Senate chamber. And I remember many years ago, one of my union heroines, her name was Anna Booth. She was an early woman on the ACTU executive, and she was the secretary of the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union. And she said to me one day, the most important characteristic for a union leader, and it was pretty tough being a union leader there in the 80s and 90s, is not intelligence, it's not power, it's not the size of your union, it's not your strategy, it's actually persistence and perseverance. And I must say, as I get older, I think that she was right. It is just hanging in there so often that can result in positive change. And sometimes positive change comes after years and years of effort, just when you think, are we ever going to get there? So thank you so much for having me and for your wonderful theme. I'm coming to you from Kaurna land. I'm looking out my window at the Adelaide Hills, and I want to acknowledge the elders, the traditional owners of these beautiful lands here in Adelaide, and that sovereignty was never ceded on this country. It is a very beautiful place to live, and I have no trouble imagining what it was like when the first boats arrived in South Australia from England, the 1836 people who arrived, and what a beautiful place it was, and how much work we have to do as a country. I don't know about you, but as a kid at school, I wasn't told the truth about what happened to First Nations people in the little country town and on the farmland that I grew up on. So I feel we have a lot of work to do, and especially in this year, to tell the truth, to move towards treaties, and to give a voice to First Nations Australians, and to recognise First Nations Australians in our Constitution. I feel like this is a really important year for us. And I want to acknowledge also First Nations people in the room, on Zoom, wherever people are, and pay my respects to you also. It's a really a great pleasure to be with such an important union, the Queensland Nurses and Midwives Union, Queensland's perhaps most powerful union, certainly a union that fights not only for the industrial conditions, the pay, the safety of nurses and midwives and assistants and anyone who gives healthcare, as you do within the union, but you also fight for the professional standards and the treatment, the respect for health workers across the health system. So I'm very conscious of all that you do. And the fact that you're a union of 70,000 people makes you a really important player in Australia, in our political system. Nurses are held in such respect, health workers broadly, people in our aged care system, people who are enrolled nurses, people who are midwives, are amongst the most respected citizens in Australia. So I think that contributes to the great power that a significant union like yours has. And the fact that you are part of a national collective of over 320,000 union members makes nurses a really important industrial and union player in our country. It wasn't always like this. I remember the 1980s when the traditional male unions, the metal workers, as we used to call them, the building workers, the maritime union workers, a very blokey club, really struggled with the rise of unions like the Nurses Union and the kind of work that nurses and midwives and carers do in the health system. We've seen a massive transformation in the last 30 years where nursing unions are now at the table and indeed in leadership in the union movement. And it's such an important shift. It means that the conversation around the union table changes. It goes to a whole range of issues that matter to Australian households and families, to women and men and to children, and the kind of services that our citizens have. So I'm just delighted to see the transformation of our union movement and the rise of important service, public sector and private sector providers like the Queensland Nurses and Midwives Union. And I also want to pay my respects to your leadership. It's hard being a union leader. I've been there in my own union in the university sector. And I want to acknowledge Sally Ann Jones as your president and Beth Mole as your secretary. And I also want to say that I've been a senator now in the Queensland, in the National Parliament for a year. And I have been really struck by the quality of the work of nursing unions, and particularly the Queensland Nurse and Midwives Union, in the submissions that I have received. I convened a select committee on work and care, and I'm going to talk a little more about that committee's work in what I say. But I want to acknowledge the great expertise that lies in your union and the way in which that expertise is brought forward to a place like the Parliament to influence what we think as senators and MPs, and then what we do in terms of legislation. I also want to acknowledge what nurses and healthcare workers and midwives have done over the last 3 years. I mean, it's been an extraordinary period in Australian history. And, there's a lot of people who pay lip service to the incredible work that goes on in hospitals and aged care facilities. But as someone who has spent quite a bit of time in the aged care facilities, in particular in the last decade, I'm just very conscious of what you did, what you gave, and under incredible circumstances, the kindness and the skill that your profession has shown to the Australian public in such a challenging time. And beyond that service and that work and that skill, you also work collectively for the good of our health system. So that's a very important, unions work on two legs, don't they? They work for members and their conditions and their rights and their protection. But they also, when they work effectively and properly, they work for the good of our society. And nursing unionism does that in spades at present. And that perseverance of the last 3 years, I think, has only increased the political standing of your organisation. And I want to talk a little about the opportunity that creates for you as members and as a union. You've campaigned for healthcare for all, for quality healthcare, and you have campaigned in a way around health which hopefully over time will help reduce inequality and disadvantage in our society. And for me, that's a really important union goal. It's a life value, and it needs strong unions that understand how important reducing inequality is and providing strong public service. I've done a lot of work with unions before I became a senator around strategy and around what makes a good union and what makes an effective union. And in my experience, unions never get anywhere without a plan. You need that persistence and perseverance, but you also need the intelligence of having a plan and a goal about where you want to go. So I think it's really important to be doing what you're doing right now, which is sitting down and thinking about where you want to go and what the strategy is that will take you there. What is the role of members and activists and leadership, and what specific things are achievable, what's next for the union. I've watched and worked with many unions over time who muddle around and do what they did yesterday in the hope that they will continue. And I think, as you have proven as a nursing body within a union, within the field of health, that's not good enough. We really need to be clear about where we've come from, but also have ambitious goals and strategies for where we want to get to next. The working conditions and the quality of our health system, they will just happen to us if we don't have a clear strategy about where we want to go and what our goals are, and a strong plan. And I recognise, of course, that your union is a democratic body, and it's incredibly important that members and activists, as you've got assembled here, build a strong voice within the union and guide the plan that the union forms. I know from looking at the history of the union movement that strong activist-based unions have a lot more power, get a lot further, and hopefully have a good plan to put that power to work around. And I know that's one of your endeavours today. So I'm just going to talk about two things as I go along. I want to talk first of all about the role of unions and reflect on how important unions are in Australian society and in our body politic. And I also then want to talk a little about the circumstances, particularly of carers, of working carers in Australian life at present, and some of the issues and changes that I think we need to see, and I think we've got an opportunity to work towards in the current moment. So just to reflect a little on the perseverance of unions over time. Well, we never got anywhere as organisations without really gutsy, persistent effort, falling over, rebuilding, being beaten sometimes, and rising up to re-strategise and move forward. Our whole history is a history of collective organisation, of working together. And I think that's a real marker of the nature of Australian union movement. The union movement in our country grew out of terrible hardship in the 1890s, a terrible recession, many people impoverished, losing their housing, and that led to the formation of strong unions, but also to the recognition that we can't just be a union movement, we also need to politically engage. Of course, that led to the formation of the Australian Labor Party. We've got a very different parliament now, right now. We've got quite a large crossbench. We've got, you know, a Senate, an upper house where no party controls it, Labor don't control it. And it's a place where you see now more voices from women. You see a lot of different political configurations. And it's really important, in my very recent experience over the past year, to see unions involved in that politics and in that conversation. The history of Australian union movement is so different from so many other countries. It is really quite unique. From its earliest days, Australian unions were interested not only in economic outcomes and a decent pay packet, though that was very important. They were also very, very devoted and interested in a social wage. They were interested in lifting the bottom and in the nature of inequality. And the very first decisions around the wage fixing of Australian arbitration machinery really went to what's a fair wage, not just what's, you know, negotiable or what bosses can get away with, but what as an Australian community do we think of as a fair wage? And that was sort of gave birth to a whole range of interests in the health system, in a public education system, in public services that are shared as a society, not just as a fractured group of individuals, but the way in which we build a society. And unions have had a big role throughout the last 150 years to create a civil society where wages are livable and where community service make building a community and having a household possible beyond poverty. We've fallen down plenty of times and we haven't got it perfect, and we're certainly not perfect now. But unions have been a big part of the fairness contribution to Australian society. And that's not to say that early unions weren't racist. They were. That they weren't sexist. They were. There are many ways in which our early unions and early unionists got things wrong. But I think we have learned a lot from our history, and we are now a much more open and involving an inclusive movement than we were historically. And we've certainly seen the massive increase in women in the leadership of and membership of the union movement. But you know, that history, imperfect as it was, leaves us with a union movement which is very different, say, than the US union movement, which was much more individualised, much more focused on the pay packet and on economic outcomes, and resulted in a society where, you know, their health system is dire and leaves so many people behind, and an education system similarly, which is very imperfect. But Australian unionism, I'm really proud to say, has always been more focused on social as well as economic outcomes. And it's also been internationalist in its perspective. You know, Australian unions really led, for example, just to give you one example, we're a part of a really big movement within Australia around ending apartheid, for example, in South Africa. Our union movement has always been well connected around the world, around international questions of justice. And I think that's a really important part of our movement as well. Apart from all the really important bread and butter issues like fighting for safe working conditions, a decent wage, a decent social wage, public services that matter for so many of us. But a big contrast with the US union movement, much more narrowly focused on wages than we have been. So many achievements. I just want to have a sense of you, of all the shot for you, of all the achievements that we all stand on in Australia. You know, we were the first country, for example, to have the 8-hour day. The stonemasons won that in Melbourne in 1856. Took a long time to get it back from long hours on a Saturday, 8 hours. You know, it was still being worked on a Saturday at the time of that decision. But we gradually got wages down from 48 hours a week down to 44, down to 40, down to 38. And that was through very long, persistent struggles by unions over many, many decades. And we still have problems with hours of work in many parts of Australia. A lot of older men or even young men work quite long hours, spend more hours in their car, for example, commuting and at work. That really restricts, for example, their ability to be around their young children. So we've got a problem of long hours for many Australians still. But on average, hours have come down, and that's been a big achievement over a long time for the union movement. We've also were early to establish a workers' comp system. From the 1900s, 1902, our first workers' compensation system. We were early to get sick leave for workers in the 1920s. The US still, so many workers in that country don't have proper sick leave. And, you know, there's such a basic first principle right. If you've ever been a carer while you're doing work, and that's probably most of us in the room, sick leave is so important to being able to hold yourself together, but also give the care that you need to the people around you in your household. And of course, holiday leave, similarly incredibly important to regenerate ourselves. If you're going to be persistent long-term as a union activist, very important to take your annual leave every year, just sticking that in as a side note. But it really matters to that regeneration of ourselves. We also were early to say there should be penalty rates. You know, there are certain hours of work that we should do, other hours of work where we should get a loading because it's unsocial time. And that was a real Australian innovation as well, alongside long service leave and some protections in the 70s or from the 70s for unfair dismissal, trying to sort of rebalance that unequal relationship between the employer and the employee around dismissal and rights to security of employment. Of course, superannuation from 1986, a very important innovation. Plenty of criticism about superannuation. It doesn't really work as well for women or for carers as it does for men. We've got a lot of issues in the superannuation system that do require attention, but the opportunity to retire is such an important right for workers, especially people who are on their feet and using their body in their labour, as so many of you do. Of course, one of our big achievements, inching towards it, has been steps towards equal pay for women. From 1969, we had the first major decision, which was to pay people doing the same work, the same rate of pay, whether they were male or female. Prior to that, very different rates of pay for men and women working alongside each other. 1972, 1974, we saw further innovations on equal pay. We moved more towards equal pay for work of equal value. So you might be doing a different job to the man at the bench next to you, but the equivalent skill levels and requirements of the job meant that you should be paid the same rate. So we've seen inching towards equal pay, but we're still a long way from equal pay. And of all the issues that I'm talking about, equal pay is probably the one where we have needed the most persistence, because we've had to push and push and push to get progress. So persistence has been especially significant on the question of equal pay, certainly for women. One of my heroes in the equal pay struggle, who really illustrates that question of persistence, is a woman called Zelda D'Aprano. I don't know whether many of you have heard of her, but she really exemplifies for me a number of key characteristics in union leadership. She's incredibly courageous. She's very funny. She was very brave and very creative. She worked in the meat industry union in the 80s and into late 60s and 70s. And she found there that a lot of women working, for example, she was in the sausage makers union initially, and then in the meat industry union, a lot of women very unhappy with their pay rates. And at the time, the meat industry was being used as a test case in that 1969 decision, the Equal Pay Campaign. And she had attended a commission hearing at the Commonwealth Conciliation Arbitration Commission for Equal Pay. She heard the advocate making the argument for equal pay. And at that time, it was Bob Hawke, of course, went on to be Prime Minister. He was an advocate for the ACTU at the time. And I'll use her words to describe what she said she saw. She was sitting in the Arbitration Commission. I just couldn't believe this. There were men arguing the case, all men for women. And I thought, here are all the women. Here we are, all sitting here as if we haven't got a brain in our bloody heads, as if we're incapable of speaking for ourselves on how much we think we're worth. And here are all these men arguing about how much we're worth, and all men are going to make the decision. And they did. And they made a series of decisions that haven't really delivered equal pay. So Zelda got together with many other women in Victoria at the time, and certainly within the meat industry, and she decided to do something a bit creative to bring attention to the equal pay case. 21st of October 1969, she chained herself to the Commonwealth building that was hearing the case in Spring Street, Melbourne, until she was cut free by the Commonwealth Police. That event drew enormous amount of attention to the Equal Pay Campaign. It put the frighteners on the blokes who were arguing the case in the commission, and it led to Zelda establishing women's organisations, women's action committees, which campaigned very strategically towards equal pay. And she made sure that progress was made working with others. So a bunch of characteristics there that underpin persistence: organisation, working together, working on a strategy, using tactics that were courageous and creative, very brave and strong and funny. The other thing, another tactic they used was travelling on public transport. They would only pay 55% of the bus fare, because that was the rate of pay they got in their factory. And they said, if that's what we're being paid in the factory, that's what you're going to get on a bus fare. So, lots of women. I'm just singling Zelda out because she wrote her story in a wonderful book about what happened to her and over her life. And of course, she had all the usual complexities that women workers had and women activists had: a family that was complex, relationships that were complex, but she hung in there and showed such a lot of grassroots leadership and power that I think we can learn lessons from today. And she persisted. She was a woman who showed great perseverance. My view now about our time right now is that there are really big opportunities for a union like yours to take the lessons of our history, to stand on top of that history, and to work out how to go forward. My assessment is, at present, there is a really strong, effective place for effective trade unions, especially like yours, a real opportunity to influence what goes on in our political machinery and in our country. The whole field of health, nursing, midwifery, and all of the aged care services and work, the health services that you and your members provide, is an essential service. It's at peak respect. People get it, and they know that they will be dependent on it at times in their lives, and they've certainly relied on it a lot in recent years. It's a large and growing industry, so that gives power in itself. It's an industry that we need for the long term, over the life cycle. Need it when we're getting born, need it on the way through, need it in old age. So a lot of power in terms of its role over the life cycle. It's a place where a lot of our kids are going to work, and the future workforce. Artificial intelligence is not going to remove the need for human touch, for human intelligence, and for human care. It may change things, certainly, but there is no substitute for humanity in the process of care. And we're in a population in a country now that really values their health and values healthcare post-COVID. I also think the public sector is seen as a place of value and importance at present, which I think is an interesting conversation in Australian society at present, which your union has a role to play in. At present, I'm doing a lot of work on the role of big consultants in our government services. And we are finding more and more evidence about how over the last 10 years, big consultants like PwC in the news at the moment, but there are other big consultants there, KPMG, EY, McKinsey's, Accenture, there's a lot of them. And they have been providing billions of dollars of services into the public sphere and pulling that work out into the private sector, raising some really important questions which the Parliament is pursuing in a range of inquiries at present. And I think this is an interesting moment for your union and for unions more broadly. I think what I'm hearing a lot of from the Australian community is people want to see a proper public sector that is, and a proper funding into services like health that give real transparency for the way in which money is spent, that give real reassurance about value for money, that gives confidence that there aren't conflicts of interest within some of these big private entities that are offering services into health, into education, into agriculture, into every part of the public sector. And what we're finding through our public inquiries in the Senate that are drawing a lot of attention is that there are massive conflicts of interest at work in parts of these large consultancies and the tendering out of big jobs. I'll just use one example that's actually achieved quite a bit of notoriety, and that's in the world of medical devices, where some companies are doing multiple transactions with multiple parties that have inbuilt conflicts of interest. You know, they're advising government on how to price medical devices. They're advising private health providers how to price them. They're advising government on how to purchase them. So there's a lot of conflicts of interest within a single entity on issues like the use of medical devices. And as a consequence, the Australian community pay too much, we are told, for some of those medical devices. So I think there's a real public curiosity about how we're spending the public dollar. Are we spending it effectively? And I think the public have had enough of misspending, of some practices that are just simply corrupt. And how do we create value for money, remove conflicts of interest, and create a robust, strong public sector rather than contracting out big parts of it into the private consulting world. So I think this is a real opportunity for unions to be effective with their voices on how we build those services properly, how we rebuild confidence in the public sector, and to push back against corrupt practices and poor value for money and those conflicts. So I spend a bit of my time in that world at present. I think it's a real opportunity for union work, as I say. The other opportunity I think that's there for unions at the moment is we see a Labor government which has a real interest in reforming workplace relations and really dealing with some of the major problems that have emerged in our workforce in recent times. For example, real concern about the growth in gig worker employment forms, which really devalue the returns to workers, make the worker bear the cost and the risk of their health and safety, take them well below a minimum wage, and give them little control over their working hours. So I think there's the Labor Party took a bunch of proposals on that question and others to the last election, 2022. We Greens are very keen to see progress towards a fairer workplace. I think we've gone backwards in terms of security of employment. No one can argue with that. We're an international standout on job insecurity, and we need to take steps. We need to rein in unfair gig work conditions. And we also need to improve things for working carers to help them put together a life with their job and see conditions of work that really help them. So one of my first jobs when I got to the Senate was to establish a select committee on work and care that looked at the ways in which workers put together a job with the rest of life, including caring for kids or for aged parents, for people with disability. How do we run a good society alongside a good workplace over the life cycle, recognising that all of us in this discussion and all of us in society at some time in our lives will have responsibility for the serious care of someone else. Might be a parent, might be a partner, might be kids, might be grandchildren. But at the moment, we've got a work structure that's built in the image of the carefree male worker. And in the last 30 years, that carefree male worker has become a minority in our labour market. More and more women have joined the workforce, so that now 1 in 2 workers, just about, are women. And on any day of the week, 4 out of 10 workers are on the job while responsible for someone else. Might be a kid at school, might be a parent waiting for a meal to be dropped off. But that complicates the business, and it's a long way from the family that was dominant at the time of the harvester wage decision in 1908, 1906. That was a time when the male breadwinner was the dominant family form. Now we are all working around each other in complex households. A growing number of us are single parents or single workers in a household where we're responsible for other people. So, lots of us go to work and come home and care for others, but we need a different kind of set of working conditions to accommodate that change. And at the moment, I think what we have is a lot of very, very energetic women workers and working carers who do the juggle, who manipulate their lives around childcare hours or after school hours, which aren't convenient, which aren't always available, which are incredibly expensive. And we juggle around our working time, use our sick leave, use our annual leave to try and hold together a complex life, which looks a lot different from the male breadwinner heading off to a building site in 1906. So what we argued in this committee, and we collected evidence from across the country, including from your union, very informative and important information about what's going on in our health workplaces around predictability of working time, around rostering, around what is a fair rate of pay given the level of skill across the health workforce. And we came to a set of recommendations which we think need to be adopted to move forward and adapt to the kind of workforce that we have now, the kind of workforce in this room. It is really important that we make fuller adjustments to the nature of the Australian worker now. And instead of making the adaptation we need towards, part-time work, towards the opportunity to move in and out of work around caring for children or other people, the opportunity to take extended periods of leave, for example, when a baby arrives or when a parent is sick or dying. We've gone the other way. We've casualised our workforce, made work less predictable for many people, and we now have 1 in 3 Australian workers without, for example, paid sick leave or paid holiday leave. That's a basic building block for a working carer, and we need to do a whole bunch of things that help restore those things and make life better for the working carers. And as I heard a lot of from your union, that goes particularly to the questions of predictable rosters, having a real say over rosters, and improving control of working time, including the right to go home and knock off, the right to disconnect from work, not to have your phone switched on all the time, waiting for a shift opportunity, or having to resist pressure to take up a shift, or having your hours changed. And it's not just, of course, in the health workforce where these issues are very pressing. They're very pressing throughout the retail sector, throughout hospitality, and in many other parts of the workforce as well. So we spent a lot of time listening to Australians. We wrote up a select committee report. It was adopted by the Labor Party and the Greens. It's a majority report, and it's working its way through a range of considerations in our parliament. And I just want to put before you some of the key issues that we think need attention. And I'm moving towards the conclusion. I've been talking a long time, and it's very strange talking to a camera. So I want to go through a bunch of things. I think one of the most important issues is how we manage our childcare system. We have had a childcare system that has grown like topsy. It's different in different states. It's incredibly expensive by international comparison. We've got massive childcare deserts in our suburbs, in our regional and areas, and in our country towns. They are like a roadblock to getting to work for many, many women and some men as well. They affect people's ability to earn a wage, and they're too expensive so that people on their third or fourth day of work are actually not making any money given the cost of childcare. So our committee, and certainly the Greens, see a strong need to make childcare not just cheaper, but eventually free. And there should be much more public provision of childcare. Why are our schools available publicly from throughout primary school into secondary school, but our early learning is not in the public sector, and instead is very expensive and patchily available? So there's a lot of work to do in our childcare sector, free and more widely available and publicly provided. And of course, alongside that, with decent conditions for the many, many workers, very skilled workers, people with a lot of experience working in the care system in early childhood education and care. That is part of the picture as we look at the work and care system of lifting the pay system across the care workforce. That is where we need to go in terms of the next steps for equal pay. We need to move towards the revaluation of work that has been done mostly by women, and is undervalued historically and still today. So a lot of work needed by our industrial relations machinery to properly pay care workers, whether they're in health or childcare or elsewhere across our work system. We also have to not only revalue that care and work out what the proper pay rate is, but we actually have to find the money to pay for it as well. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that we can find billions of dollars to pay for submarines. We can find billions of dollars for various tax breaks. We can fail to collect tax from some very big companies in quite the fair share way that most of us would think was appropriate, but we still can't get the money that we need for a proper pay system for our care sector. So we need to work out how to fund proper childcare pay and health rates of pay across that system and fund it from the public sector. We also need to play catch up on parental leave. I know there are midwives in the room, and I've been the beneficiary of, that 12 months off when you have your first child or second child. I learned by the time my second arrived to make sure that 12 months was there. So many Australian women still, and households, men and women, don't get the opportunity to be with that newborn. We know it makes a difference to the lifetime opportunities for that child. It improves the nature of the family, that they have that peaceful, not peaceful, what am I saying? That time together as a family early on, and to take the pressure off a breastfeeding mother, for example. So we really are right at the bottom of the pack in the OECD now in terms of the period of leave, paid leave that we give people. The average is now around 52 weeks. We're still, moving to half that level. We need to improve paid parental leave to give families and infants the best start that they can get. We also need to fix the leave situation for our casual workers, for the so many workers in Australia that are precarious, and improve their job security, and fix rostering and predictable working time. I think there's a whole bunch of things there that we need to move forward on, and I think this is where the voice of unions and the strategy of unions is so important to provide leadership and hope for the rest of the Australian community. Union density is low at present, but the power of a union like yours remains very significant, and the Australian community needs that leadership as we move forward to make better the working conditions around our workforce, and especially around working carers. So as I come to a close, let me encourage you to work on that plan and that clear strategy about where you're going to go. It's the first step towards winning improvements, and we've got a long way to travel to make things better for the kids and the generations that come. Wage justice for nurses and midwives, enrolled nurses and carers, real equal pay, more control over our working time, genuine rest and holiday leave for workers, and an appropriate spend on our health system. Perseverance is the only way we're going to get there. And so I think your theme is spot on. I wish you well for your day. And I just want to end by saying that one of the lessons I've learned along the road of activism, I've done all kinds, like many of you in the room, certainly at a workplace level as a delegate, but also now in the Senate and in many other ways as an educator and as a unionist. It's really important that we remember that one of the fuels for perseverance is friendship and fun. They're really important, that we get a laugh every day with the people that we're working with in our union and in our workplace. And I know that that happens for many of you, but that is fuel for our perseverance. And it's really, really important. The only reason I'm sitting here, often with a smile on my face, is the amazing colleagues I work with and the laughs that we get. And that it's just really important that we have that alongside the knowledge that what we're fighting for is right. It's the right thing to do for our kids and all the generations that come. That's where our real power comes from. The sense that we have values, that they motivate us and they fuel that perseverance. So best wishes. You're on the right side of history. I hope your day goes well, and all power to you and the union. Thank you.